The pilot's voice cut through the cabin like a blade. "Ma'am, you need to move, now!" Every conversation stopped. The hum of the engines seemed to shrink, as if the aircraft itself were listening. Outside the narrow windows, Christmas Eve darkness pressed against the fuselage, thick and endless. The Rockies somewhere below like buried bones. The woman did not look up right away. She sat in the forward seat, hands folded over a paperback with a cracked spine, legs crossed at the ankle. No jewelry, no designer bag in sight. Just a dark wool coat, worn but clean, and boots that had seen too many winters to count. Her hair was braided close to her scalp, neat and practical. Her face carried the calm of someone who had learned, long ago, that panic wasted energy. The pilot stood over her, tall, broad-shouldered, grey at the temples. Captain Nathan Holloway, 62 years old, 25,000 flight hours. A man used to instant compliance. He held his tablet like a badge. "I won't ask you again," he said. His tone wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Authority lived in the way his jaw tightened, in the way he angled his body to block the aisle. A flight attendant hovered behind him, younger, pale, fingers clenched around a leather safety strap. Her name tag read Emily Parker. She looked at the woman in the seat, then at the pilot, then away, as if choosing which regret she would carry home for Christmas. The woman finally lifted her eyes. They were dark, steady, unimpressed. "I heard you," she said. Her voice was low, controlled. No tremor, no apology. That, more than anything, irritated Holloway. "This seat is reserved," he said. "You were placed here by mistake. The principal charter passengers are arriving any minute, and I will not start this flight with a problem." Problem. The word hung in the air, heavy, loaded. A man across the aisle shifted uncomfortably. An older couple, near the window, exchanged a glance that said, "We have seen this before, and we never like how it ends." The woman closed her book with care, sliding a finger between the pages to mark her place. She did not stand. "Then you should check your manifest again," she said. Holloway let out a short, humorless breath. "I already did." What he did not say was that he had skimmed it, that he had seen the name listed under corporate ownership, non-principal rider, and dismissed it. That in his mind, owners looked a certain way. They traveled with assistants, lawyers, noise. They did not sit quietly reading paperbacks like someone killing time at a bus station. "You can take the rear cabin," he continued. "There's a seat open near the galley. We'll get you settled before we taxi." Behind him, Emily swallowed hard. "Captain, maybe dispatch." Holloway raised one finger without turning. Emily fell silent. The woman in the seat glanced past him, toward the open cabin door. Cold air crept in, sharp and metallic, carrying the smell of snow and jet fuel. She could hear voices outside now. Laughter. A man complaining loudly about the cold. A woman's heels clicking against metal stairs. They were close. She stood, slowly. Not in surrender, but with deliberate calm. The aisle felt narrower when she rose, the ceiling lower. Holloway stepped back half an inch, surprised despite himself. As she reached for her coat, a man in the second row leaned forward. Late 60s, silver hair, thick glasses. He spoke before he could stop himself. "That doesn't seem right," he said. If she was cleared to board, Holloway turned his head just enough to fix him with a look. "Sir, this doesn't concern you." The man leaned back, lips pressed thin. His wife touched his arm. A quiet truce. The woman slipped her coat on, button by button. Her hands were steady, but inside, something old and bitter stirred. Not anger, not yet. Recognition. She had been here before. Different rooms, different uniforms, same assumption. Emily. Holloway said, already turning away. Show her to the rear. Emily nodded, too quickly. She met the woman's eyes. There was something there, an apology she could not voice, fear, and a question she did not dare ask. This way, Emily murmured. The woman followed, boots soft against the carpet. As she passed the second row, the silver-haired man met her gaze again. He gave a small nod. Respect. Or regret. It was hard to tell. She reached the rear cabin just as the main passengers boarded. Robert and Linda Whittaker. Robert was tall, 58, his posture stiff with entitlement and cold. Linda was younger, sharp-featured, wrapped in a cashmere coat the color of bone. Her eyes swept the cabin like an inspection. She stopped short. Why is someone else on this flight? Linda said. Not curious, offended. Robert glanced toward the rear, then back to Holloway. I thought this was exclusive. It is, Holloway said smoothly. Just a minor adjustment. Linda's gaze lingered a second longer than necessary on the woman standing near the galley. Something like disdain flickered across her face. Well, she said, as long as she's not up front. The woman heard every word. Emily guided her into the jump seat near the galley wall, narrow, upright, designed for minutes, not hours. A faint smell of coffee and disinfectant clung to the air. I'm sorry, Emily whispered as she secured the strap. I really am. The woman nodded once. It's all right. It wasn't, but she did not say that. She sat as the door closed, sealing them inside. Outside, snow fell harder now, swirling in the floodlights. Inside, the engines began their low, rising whine. Up front, Linda laughed at something Holloway said. Robert checked his phone, already absorbed in emails that would never love him back. And in the rear, the woman closed her eyes for a brief moment. Her name was Margaret Lewis. She had signed the purchase agreement for this aircraft 12 years ago, in a quiet conference room overlooking Lake Michigan. She had paid for it with money earned the slow way: contracts, failures, lawsuits, long nights when no one believed her name would matter. Tonight, she said nothing. Not yet. Because some truths were sharper when revealed at altitude, when there was nowhere to walk away, and everyone had already shown exactly who they believed you were. The engine spooled higher, the sound deepening into a steady, vibrating growl that pressed into the bones. The aircraft rolled forward, slow at first, then with purpose, tires humming against frozen tarmac. Margaret sat rigid in the jump seat, shoulders squared, eyes open now, watching the narrow slice of cabin through the gap in the curtain, like someone studying a courtroom before the judge enters. The takeoff was clean. Too clean. A practiced ascent into black sky, the kind Captain Holloway prided himself on. As the plane climbed, gravity pinned Margaret into the thin padding of the seat. The strap across her chest bit just enough to remind her she was not meant to be here. Up front, champagne corks popped. The sound cracked through the cabin, sharp and celebratory. Linda Whittaker's laugh followed, bright and careless, as if the night existed solely for her enjoyment. The laugh carried farther than she realized. It always did. Emily moved quietly through the galley, securing drawers, checking latches. She avoided looking at Margaret, not out of cruelty, but fear. Fear had a way of narrowing vision, of making good people obedient. Margaret's phone vibrated once in her coat pocket. She did not reach for it. Instead, she stared at the brushed metal wall in front of her, at her own faint reflection, distorted by vibration. Her face looked older there, lines earned, not apologized for. She breathed in through her nose, slow, counting heartbeats the way she had learned during depositions when opposing counsel tried to rattle her. Control the breath, control the room. Another vibration. This one longer. Emily noticed. Her eyes flicked to Margaret's pocket, then away again. She pretended to focus on the coffee machine. The plane leveled off. The engines settled into a lower, constant tone, a mechanical heartbeat. Seatbelt sign still on. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting everything in warm amber. It softened edges. It did not soften intent. Captain Holloway's voice came over the intercom. Calm, confident, polished. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude. Weather ahead is clear. Flight time will be just under 4 hours. Sit back and enjoy the ride. Margaret almost smiled at the irony. Behind the curtain, Robert Whittaker leaned forward in his seat, loosening his tie. Finally, he muttered, "It's been a day."
Linda kicked off her heels, tucking her feet beneath her.
"You should have taken my jet," she said. "At least my crew knows how to keep things exclusive." Holloway chuckled from the cockpit doorway. "Hard to beat ownership pride," he said. "Some people like knowing exactly who they're flying with." Margaret heard the word like a tap on glass. Some people. Emily's hands shook as she poured water into a glass. She carried it to Margaret without being asked, her movements careful, almost reverent. "For you," she whispered, "in case you need it." Margaret accepted the glass. Their fingers brushed. Emily flinched, then steadied herself. "Thank you," Margaret said. Emily hesitated. "If you need anything else, I'll let you know." Emily nodded, relief and guilt crossing her face in quick succession. She retreated, shoulders tense. Margaret took a sip of water. It tasted flat, recycled, necessary. Her phone vibrated again, twice this time. She reached into her pocket and pulled it out, shielding the screen with her palm. The glow illuminated her face from below, sharp and unfamiliar. A message preview sat at the top. Operations flagged seating discrepancy. Please confirm location of owner representative. Margaret locked the screen without responding. Up front, Linda's voice rose, irritated. "I asked for crushed ice. This is cubes." Emily responded softly, apologetic. "I'm sorry, Mom. This aircraft doesn't have—" "Well then, improvise," Linda snapped. "That's what you're paid for." Emily nodded again. Too fast. Margaret watched the exchange through the reflection on the galley wall. She saw Emily's shoulders draw inward, saw the way Linda never once looked her in the eye. It was a familiar choreography. Power expressed through dismissal. Cruelty disguised as preference. The plane hit light turbulence. Nothing dramatic, just enough to rattle glassware, to make conversation pause mid-sentence. Holloway adjusted course without comment. Robert glanced toward the cockpit. "Everything all right up there?" "All good," Holloway called back. "Just a little mountain air." Linda rolled her eyes. "I hate surprises." Margaret's phone vibrated again. Longer this time. Persistent. She unlocked it. A secure thread opened, marked Internal. Names scrolled past. Operations Director, Legal Counsel, Fleet Management. She read without blinking. Preliminary audit shows seating override issued manually by flight crew. No dispatch confirmation logged. Request guidance. Margaret's thumb hovered over the screen. She remembered the first time she'd been asked to move out of a room like she did not belong. It had been decades ago, in a boardroom that smelled like stale coffee and old carpet. She had been younger then, quicker to speak, slower to listen. She typed a single line. Acknowledge. Continue normal operations. Document only. She sent it and locked the phone. The plane lurched again, harder this time. A tray clattered. Linda let out a sharp gasp, clutching her armrest. Robert swore under his breath. Holloway's voice came over the intercom again, tighter now. "Just a brief pocket of turbulence. Please remain seated." Emily hurried to secure loose items. She passed Margaret, paused. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. Margaret nodded. "I've been through worse." Emily studied her for a moment. as if trying to reconcile that statement with the woman she thought she saw. Then she moved on. In the cabin, conversation shifted. Robert's phone chimed repeatedly. He frowned, scrolling. "Something wrong?" Linda asked. "Just work," he said. "They're nervous about timing." "On Christmas Eve?" Linda scoffed. "That's their problem." Robert didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the screen longer than comfort allowed. He typed, deleted, typed again. The plane steadied. Silence returned, heavier now. Margaret closed her eyes, but she did not rest. Her mind moved methodically, like a hand tracing cracks in stone. She considered Holloway's tone, Linda's certainty, Emily's fear, Robert's distraction. This was not about a seat. It never was. Her phone vibrated once more. "Operations requesting clarification. Owner representative not visible in principal cabin." Margaret inhaled slowly. Not yet, she thought. She typed again. "Maintain course. I will address upon landing." She sent it. Up front, Linda leaned toward Holloway, lowering her voice. "You're sure we won't have any more surprises?" Holloway smiled. Easy, practiced. "Not a chance." Margaret opened her eyes. The aircraft cut through the night, lights blinking against endless dark. Somewhere below, towns slept, unaware of the quiet reckoning unfolding at 30,000 feet. The engines droned on, indifferent. Margaret adjusted the strap across her chest, feeling its resistance. She did not look away from the reflection in the metal wall, from the woman staring back at her with calm, measured resolve. She had given them time. They were using it exactly as expected. The turbulence returned without warning. Not the gentle kind that rattled glasses, but the sharp, sudden drop that stole breath and slammed bodies into restraints. The cabin lights flickered. A suitcase thumped hard inside an overhead bin. Somewhere up front, Linda Whittaker screamed, a raw sound stripped of composure. The aircraft shuddered, then leveled out just enough to feel unstable, like a held breath. "Seatbelts," Captain Holloway snapped over the intercom, his voice no longer smooth. "Everyone stay seated." Margaret's shoulders pressed back into the jump seat as the force settled. The thin padding did nothing to soften it. She tasted metal at the back of her tongue. Not fear, but focus. The body sharpening itself for consequence. Emily stumbled, caught herself on the galley counter, knuckles whitening as she steadied a cabinet door that had popped open. She exhaled shakily, then glanced back at Margaret. "You okay?" she asked, louder now, urgency breaking through protocol. Margaret nodded once. "I'm fine. You?" Emily swallowed. "I think so." Up front, Robert Whittaker's voice cut through the cabin. "What the hell was that?" "Clear air turbulence," Holloway answered too quickly. "Nothing we can't handle." But Margaret heard the difference. The clipped cadence, the missing humor. Linda wasn't reassured. "I don't like this," she said. "You said the weather was clear." Holloway did not respond immediately. Margaret felt her phone vibrate again. She did not look at it this time. She didn't need to. She could hear it in the way the engines adjusted, in the subtle pitch change that told her they were correcting more than Holloway wanted to admit. She had spent enough hours in these cabins, enough late nights crossing continents, to know when confidence was being performed. Emily secured the last loose drawer and leaned against the counter, chest rising and falling. She glanced toward the cockpit door, then back at Margaret, as if weighing something. "Can I ask you something?" Emily said quietly. Margaret met her eyes. "You already are." Emily let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "You don't act like most people who get pushed around." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "What does that look like?" "Anger," Emily said. "Or fear. Or both." And what do I look like? Emily hesitated. Like you're taking notes. Margaret smiled, small and fleeting. Old habit. Another jolt rippled through the plane, shorter this time, but no less violent. Linda yelped again, grabbing Robert's arm. That's it, Linda said. I want to know what's going on, right now. Robert leaned forward, his face tight. Nathan, he called toward the cockpit, using Holloway's first name without permission. Do we need to be concerned? The cockpit door cracked open. Holloway stepped into the aisle, one hand braced against a seat as the plane vibrated beneath them. His expression was controlled, but sweat darkened the fabric at his collar. No, he said. We're adjusting altitude, that's all. Linda's eyes flicked past him, toward the rear of the cabin, toward Margaret. And she's still back there? Linda asked. During turbulence? Emily stiffened. Margaret watched Holloway carefully. She saw the calculation flicker across his face, the way stress stripped layers away until only instinct remained. She's secured, Holloway said. Linda's mouth tightened. That's not what I asked. Holloway glanced back, irritation flashing. Everyone is secured. Robert cleared his throat. Let it go, Linda. She did not. I don't like unknowns, Linda said, especially not on my flight. Margaret felt the words land like a stone dropped in water, ripples spreading outward. Emily's jaw clenched. Robert looked away, embarrassed but unwilling to intervene. Margaret spoke before she intended to. Then you should ask better questions. The cabin went still. Holloway turned slowly. What did you say? He asked. Margaret met his gaze, unflinching. I said, if you don't like unknowns, you should ask better questions. Silence stretched. The engines roared on, indifferent. Linda stared, disbelief giving way to offense. Excuse me? Robert shifted, uneasy now. Maybe we should all just... Who do you think you are? Linda snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut. You're lucky you're even on this plane. Emily sucked in a breath. Mom, Margaret raised a hand, stopping her gently. Her eyes never left Linda's face. I think, Margaret said, evenly, that this flight is under enough strain without adding ego to the mix. Linda laughed, a brittle sound. Ego? You're sitting in a crew seat lecturing me about ego. Holloway stepped forward. That's enough. Margaret turned to him. Agreed. Something in her tone gave him pause. Not defiance, not submission. Certainty. Another vibration rippled through the floor, less violent now, but persistent. The plane felt like it was riding invisible waves. Robert checked his phone again, frowning deeper this time. I'm losing signal, he muttered. Margaret's phone vibrated hard against her leg. She ignored it for a full 3 seconds, then reached into her pocket. Emily watched her closely now. Margaret unlocked the screen. Multiple messages stacked, marked urgent. Flight ops escalating. Media risk flagged due to charter ownership overlap. Legal standing requires confirmation of onboard authority. Margaret exhaled slowly through her nose. She typed, Stand by. Do not intervene. I will handle. She sent it, then looked up. Holloway was watching her now, suspicion creeping into his expression. Who are you texting? He asked. Margaret slipped the phone back into her pocket. People who don't enjoy surprises either. Linda scoffed. Unbelievable. Robert finally looked at Margaret properly. Really looked. At the calm in her posture. At the absence of fear. At the way Holloway, for the first time since boarding, seemed slightly off balance. Linda, he said quietly. Enough. She rounded on him. Don't start. The cockpit door opened again, this time wider. The co-pilot, younger, tense, leaned out. Captain, he said, we need you. Holloway hesitated, then nodded. He looked at Margaret one last time, his gaze searching. "You," he said, pointing. "Stay put." Margaret inclined her head. "I have been." Holloway disappeared back into the cockpit. The cabin felt different without him. Smaller. Exposed. Emily let out a breath she had been holding. She looked at Margaret, then at Linda, then back again. "I'm sorry," Emily said. Not to Linda, not to Robert, but to Margaret.
Margaret met her eyes.
"I know." Another bump, gentler now. The plane steadied, slowly, reluctantly. Robert leaned closer to Linda, lowering his voice. "You're making this worse." She shrugged him off. "I'm not the problem." Margaret watched them, a familiar sadness settling in her chest. Not for herself. For Emily. For Holloway. For the quiet certainty that none of this would be undone by explanations. Her phone vibrated one final time. She did not look at it. Outside, the night stretched on, endless and cold. Inside, the tension coiled tighter, waiting. Margaret folded her hands in her lap and stared straight ahead, the reflection in the metal wall steady and unyielding. They still thought this was about a seat. They were wrong. The calm did not return. It only thinned. The aircraft leveled out, but the silence that followed was sharp, brittle, like glass waiting to crack. The engines droned in a lower register now, steady but strained, a sound Margaret recognized as controlled effort rather than ease. The kind of sound machines made when they were being pushed just enough to obey. Emily sat in the opposite jump seat, hands folded tight in her lap, eyes fixed forward. She had stopped pretending this was a normal flight. Her breathing was shallow, measured, the way people breathe when they are afraid of drawing attention to themselves. Up front, Linda Whittaker broke the quiet first. "This is ridiculous," she said, loud enough to carry. "We paid good money for this flight. I don't expect drama." Robert didn't answer. His phone sat dark in his hand now, signal gone completely. He stared at it anyway, thumb hovering over the screen as if willing it back to life. The turbulence had shaken more than the plane. It had cracked something in him. Confidence, maybe. Or denial. Margaret watched him through the reflection on the galley wall. She saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his shoulders slumped a fraction. A man used to leverage, realizing, slowly, that he had none. The cockpit door opened again. Captain Holloway stepped out, but this time he did not fill the aisle with confidence. His posture was rigid, his movements precise, as if he were consciously performing control. A thin sheen of sweat glistened at his hairline. "Everything is stable," he announced. "We're adjusting our route slightly to avoid further turbulence." Linda crossed her arms. "You said that already." Holloway ignored the tone. "We'll be landing on time." Margaret felt her phone vibrate again. Longer, insistent. She looked at it now. A new message sat at the top of the screen, flagged priority. Chairman requesting immediate confirmation. Regulatory exposure increasing. Recommend disclosure before landing. Margaret stared at the words, then locked the screen. Not yet. Holloway's eyes flicked to her hands, to the phone. Suspicion sharpened into something closer to recognition, though he didn't yet know what shape it would take. "Ma'am," he said, addressing her directly now, "I need to know why operations keeps asking about you." The cabin stilled. Even Linda stopped fidgeting. Margaret looked up slowly. Her gaze met Holloway's, steady and unblinking. "Because they finally noticed I wasn't where you put me," she said. Emily sucked in a breath. Holloway's jaw tightened. "You're listed as a corporate rider." "That's correct." "Then operations has no reason to." "Unless," Margaret said evenly, "they understand what that designation actually means." Robert looked up sharply, His eyes moved between them now, alert, calculating. Linda laughed, dismissive. Oh, please. Are we really doing this now? Margaret did not look at her. Holloway took a step closer, lowering his voice. If there's something I need to know, you should tell me. Margaret studied him, not with anger, with assessment. She saw a man whose authority had never been seriously questioned. A man who believed experience excused assumption. A man standing at the edge of a realization that would not be gentle. Captain, she said, you already made your decision tonight. His eyes flickered. I made a seating correction. You made a judgment, Margaret replied. And then you enforced it. Linda snorted. Oh my God. Robert held up a hand, quiet for once. Linda, stop. She stared at him. Don't tell me to stop. I said stop. The word landed heavier than anything Margaret had said. Linda turned away, lips pressed thin. Holloway exhaled slowly. This flight needs focus. I don't have time for accountability? Margaret asked. The word hung there, dangerous and precise. Emily shifted in her seat, torn. She glanced toward the cockpit, then back at Margaret. Captain, she said softly, maybe we should just... Holloway cut her off with a look. She fell silent again. Margaret felt the moment tighten. This was the point where truth could still be delayed, where denial could still be chosen. She had delayed long enough. Her phone vibrated again. She answered it this time, lifting it to her ear. Yes, she said. No one could hear the voice on the other end, but everyone felt the shift. The way her posture straightened, the way her tone changed. Not louder, sharper. I'm on board, she continued. Yes, I'm aware. No, I don't want this handled mid-air. Document everything. We'll address it on the ground. She paused, listening. Yes, I'm certain. She ended the call and lowered the phone. Holloway stared at her. Who was that? Margaret met his gaze. The chairman of the company that owns this aircraft. The words did not explode. They did not echo. They simply settled, heavy and irrevocable. Robert's face drained of color. Linda laughed again, but this time the sound cracked halfway through. That's not funny. I'm not joking, Margaret said. Holloway felt the floor tilt beneath him, though the plane was steady. His mind raced, grasping for alternatives, explanations that did not end with him standing in front of the wrong person. That's not possible, he said. Ownership doesn't always look the way you expect, Margaret finished. Emily's mouth fell open. Robert stared at Margaret now, as if seeing her for the first time. His voice came out hoarse. You're saying you own this plane? Margaret nodded once. Among other things. Linda shook her head, backing away in her seat. No, that's ridiculous. Margaret turned to her then, finally. Her gaze was calm, but there was something cold beneath it now. Not cruelty, judgment. You assumed I didn't belong, Margaret said. All of you did. Some of you said it out loud. Linda opened her mouth, then closed it again. Holloway swallowed hard. Why didn't you say something sooner? Margaret looked at him steadily.
Because I wanted to know how you would behave if you thought I didn't matter.
Silence flooded the cabin. The engines hummed on. The night outside remained unchanged. Robert lowered his head, shame settling over him like a weight. He had let it happen, had watched and said nothing. Emily's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Holloway stood frozen, the uniform suddenly too heavy on his shoulders. Years of authority collapsed inward, replaced by the slow, dawning understanding of consequence. Margaret broke the silence. We will land, she said. Everyone will walk off this plane. And then this night will continue for each of us in very different ways. Her voice was not raised. It did not need to be. This isn't about punishment, she added. It's about record, about pattern, about what happens when power is exercised without reflection. Holloway nodded slowly, mechanically. Understood. Margaret held his gaze a moment longer, then looked away, back toward the darkened window. The aircraft cut through the night, steady now, obedient. Behind them, far below, the world went on, unaware. Ahead, the runway waited. And nothing that mattered was going to be forgotten. The plane did not descend immediately. It held its altitude, cutting through the dark like a blade suspended in air, as if even the machine needed a moment to understand what had changed. No one spoke. Captain Holloway turned back toward the cockpit without another word. His movements were stiff now, economical, stripped of confidence. The door closed behind him with a muted thud that sounded final in a way no door ever should. From inside, the low murmur of instruments and controlled voices resumed, tighter, clipped, professional. The flight would continue. The reckoning would not. Robert Whittaker sat frozen in his seat, hands resting uselessly on his knees. His breathing was shallow. His mind raced in tight, desperate circles, replaying the moments he could have interrupted, the silences he had chosen instead. He had built a career on reading rooms, on sensing when power shifted. Tonight, he had misread everything. Linda stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, eyes glassy with disbelief. The certainty she carried so easily had evaporated, leaving something raw behind it. Fear, maybe, or humiliation. Her foot tapped against the carpet, fast and erratic, as if movement alone could undo what had been said. Emily remained strapped into the jump seat, hands trembling despite her effort to still them. Her heart hammered so loudly she was sure others could hear it. She kept stealing glances at Margaret, trying to reconcile the quiet woman beside her with the weight of what she now represented. Authority without display. Power without warning. Margaret sat unmoving. Her hands rested calmly in her lap. Her gaze was fixed forward, not on the passengers, not on the cockpit, but on the narrow sliver of night visible through the galley window. Snow-dusted ridgelines passed far below, silver under moonlight. She had crossed oceans in silence. She had sat through hostile negotiations where men twice as loud tried to break her by force of personality alone. This moment felt smaller than those, and heavier. Her phone vibrated again. She looked at it. Incoming call. Fleet operations. She declined it. Not yet. The intercom clicked on. Holloway's voice returned, stripped of flourish. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent shortly. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened." No jokes, no charm, just procedure. Linda exhaled sharply. "Unbelievable," she muttered. Robert finally turned toward Margaret. His voice was low, careful, like someone approaching a wild animal. "Ms. Lewis, I didn't know." Margaret did not look at him. "You didn't ask." The words landed with quiet precision. Robert swallowed. "You're right." Silence followed. The kind that forces self-reflection, whether you want it or not. The aircraft began its gradual descent, nose dipping slightly, engines adjusting with a controlled whine. Gravity shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Emily felt it in her chest, a tightening that had nothing to do with altitude. She cleared her throat. "Ms. Lewis," she said softly. Margaret turned to her. "I just want you to know," Emily continued, voice shaking but resolute. "I should have said something sooner." Margaret studied her face. The fear, the sincerity, the moral weight settling in real time. "You did what you could," Margaret said. "And then you did more." Emily nodded. tears finally spilling over. She wiped them away quickly, embarrassed. Linda watched the exchange, something unreadable passing across her expression. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then finally spoke. "So what happens now?" she asked, brittle. "You get us kicked off? You ruin Christmas?" Margaret turned to her slowly. "No," she said. "Christmas will survive this." Linda scoffed weakly. "Easy for you to say." Margaret met her gaze. "This is easy for no one." Robert leaned forward. "If there's anything I can do." Margaret raised a hand, stopping him gently. "This isn't a negotiation." The descent steepened. The cabin lights brightened incrementally. The mountains below rose to meet them, dark silhouettes against the stars. The runway lights appeared in the distance, a thin, glowing line of inevitability. Holloway's voice came over the intercom again. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Emily straightened instinctively, professionalism overriding emotion. She checked her harness, her surroundings, her breath. Margaret adjusted the strap across her chest, feeling the pressure settle. This was the part she knew well. The moment before impact. The pause before consequence. The wheels hit the runway harder than necessary. A jolt ran through the cabin. Linda gasped. Robert grabbed the armrest. The aircraft bounced once, then settled, tires screaming briefly against cold asphalt before slowing. No one applauded. As the plane taxied toward the private terminal, flashing lights appeared ahead. Security vehicles, operations staff, quiet figures waiting with purpose. Emily's eyes widened. They're already here. Margaret nodded once. They were supposed to be. The aircraft came to a stop, engines powered down. The sudden silence rang louder than the turbulence ever had. Holloway emerged from the cockpit slowly. He did not look at anyone at first. His shoulders sagged, the weight of realization fully settled now. When he finally met Margaret's eyes, there was no defiance left, only resignation. "The ground team is waiting," he said. "I know," Margaret replied. The cabin door opened. Cold air rushed in, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and snow. Footsteps echoed on the stairs. Voices murmured, low and professional. No shouting, no spectacle. Just process. Robert stood, hesitated, then turned back to Margaret. "I'm sorry," he said again. This time it sounded different. Quieter. Real. Margaret inclined her head slightly. "That matters," she said. "What you do next matters more." Linda rose stiffly, wrapping her coat tighter around herself. She did not look at Margaret as she passed. Pride still clung to her like frost. Emily unbuckled last. She paused beside Margaret, unsure. "Thank you," she whispered. Margaret smiled faintly. "For what?" "For reminding me who I want to be." Margaret's smile lingered just a second longer. They stepped off the plane into the cold night. The mountains loomed silent and indifferent. The lights were bright, but not blinding. Faces were calm, ready. Margaret stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, looking out over the scene. Not triumphant, not vengeful, just resolved. This was not the end. It was the beginning of the part no one saw. The cold hit harder on the tarmac than it had inside the cabin. It cut through coats and certainty alike, a sharp reminder that altitude insulated more than just bodies. Floodlights washed the scene in white, flattening faces, stripping away pretense. Everything looked smaller out here. People, titles, excuses. Margaret descended the stairs last. She moved without hurry, one hand resting lightly on the rail, boots steady against the metal steps. Below, 2 men from flight operations waited, dark coats, badges clipped, posture formal but not stiff. They did not rush her. They knew better. Power, when real, did not require pursuit. Captain Holloway stood off to one side, flanked by a security supervisor. He was no longer the man who had filled the cabin with his presence. His shoulders sloped forward now, as if gravity had finally found him. He kept his eyes down, focused on a patch of ice near his shoe, unwilling to meet the gaze he now understood too late. Robert and Linda Whittaker were already on the ground. Robert stood apart, hands shoved into his pockets, breath fogging the air in uneven bursts. Linda paced in short, sharp steps, heels clicking angrily against the concrete, her movements too fast for the cold. She looked like someone trying to outrun a thought that refused to let go. Emily stood near the bottom of the stairs, hugging her coat close, eyes wide as she took in the quiet choreography unfolding around her. No shouting, no accusations, just professionals doing exactly what they had been trained to do. Margaret stepped onto the tarmac. The operations director, a man in his early 50s with steel grey hair and a face shaped by long nights and longer consequences, nodded once. "Ms. Lewis." "Mark," Margaret replied. He gestured subtly toward the terminal. "We can talk inside." "In a moment," Margaret said. She turned first toward Captain Holloway. He stiffened when he realized she was addressing him. Slowly, he raised his head. His eyes were rimmed red, not from tears but from the effort of holding them back. "I want you to listen carefully," Margaret said. Her voice carried easily in the cold, steady and controlled. No anger, no satisfaction. "This is not a public confrontation," she continued. "There will be no statements tonight, no scene. You will cooperate with the review. You will answer questions honestly. That is all." Holloway nodded, too quickly. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "Do you understand why this is happening?" He hesitated. That hesitation mattered more than any apology. "Yes," he said finally. "I assumed. I enforced that assumption." Margaret held his gaze. "And?" "And I used my authority to protect my comfort," he added, voice tight. "Not the flight." Margaret let the silence stretch. The floodlights hummed. Somewhere in the distance, another aircraft taxied, oblivious. "That's the part that ends careers," she said. Holloway swallowed hard. "I know." She nodded once. The conversation was over. She turned next to Robert Whittaker. He straightened instinctively, as if bracing for impact. "Ms. Lewis?" "Mr. Whittaker," Margaret replied. "You had opportunities tonight." He winced. "I did." "And you chose silence?" "Yes." "Why?" Robert hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because speaking up would have cost me social capital in the moment, and I told myself it wasn't my place." Margaret studied him. "That's how harm survives," she said, "by being inconvenient to interrupt." Robert nodded, shame etched deep into his features. "I won't forget that." "You shouldn't," Margaret said. "But you also shouldn't confuse regret with repair. If you want to do better, you'll find the opportunity. It always comes back around." He exhaled slowly. "Thank you for saying that." Margaret did not respond. She turned to Linda. Linda stopped pacing when she realized Margaret was facing her. For a split second, defiance flared. Then it flickered, weakened by exhaustion and cold. "So what now?" Linda demanded. "You make sure everyone knows? You blacklist us?" Margaret regarded her quietly. The wind tugged at her coat. Snow whispered across the tarmac. "No," she said. "I don't need to do anything." Linda scoffed. "Then what was the point of all this?" Margaret's eyes hardened just slightly. "The point," she said, "was that you showed exactly who you are when you believed no one important was watching." Linda's mouth opened, then closed again. Words failed her. That, too, was revealing. Margaret turned away. Emily stood nearby, frozen in place, unsure where she belonged in this moment. Margaret caught her eye. "Emily," she said. Emily jumped. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret's expression softened, the edges easing. "You'll be asked for a statement." Emily nodded nervously. "I understand." "Tell the truth," Margaret said. "Not the version that protects you. The version that protects the next person." Emily's eyes filled again, but she smiled. "I will." Margaret inclined her head. "Good." Mark cleared his throat gently. "Ms. Lewis, the car is ready." Margaret glanced toward the black sedan idling near the terminal, engine purring softly, warmth waiting inside. She felt the weight of the night settle at last, heavy but contained. "One more thing," she said. Mark paused. "Of course." "This review," Margaret continued, "won't end with one person." Mark nodded slowly. "I suspected as much." "This isn't about a pilot," Margaret said. "It's about a culture that mistook authority for character. I want that examined. Fully." "It will be," Mark said. "You have my word." Margaret held his gaze, then nodded. She walked toward the car, boots crunching softly on ice. The door opened. Warm air spilled out, carrying the faint scent of leather and cedar. Before she stepped inside, she paused and looked back once. Captain Holloway stood motionless, surrounded by process he could no longer command. Robert stared at the ground, lost in thought. Linda hugged herself, small and furious and suddenly irrelevant. Emily stood straighter than she had all night. Margaret took it all in. Not with triumph, with clarity. She got into the car. The door closed with a quiet, decisive thump. As the sedan pulled away, tires gripping the frozen pavement, the terminal lights receded into the distance. Behind her, paperwork would be filed, meetings scheduled, careers altered. None of it would be dramatic. All of it would matter. Margaret leaned back against the seat and closed her eyes. Christmas Eve had not gone as planned, but it had revealed exactly what it needed to. Morning came without mercy. Grey light crept over the mountains, thin and unforgiving, revealing every hard edge the night had hit. The private terminal was quiet now, stripped of drama, humming only with the low routine of early operations. Coffee machines hissed. Doors slid open and shut. People spoke in muted tones, as if the night before had taught them restraint. Margaret sat alone in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the runway. Her coat lay folded beside her. A paper cup of coffee steamed untouched in front of her. She had been awake for hours, not from adrenaline, but from the familiar weight that followed decisions that could not be undone. She did not regret them. Regret was a luxury for people without responsibility. Across the table, Mark reviewed a digital file on his tablet. He scrolled slowly, methodically, the way people do when they already know what they are going to find. "Captain Holloway has been formally relieved of duty," he said, "effective immediately. Standard procedure pending investigation." Margaret nodded. "And the co-pilot?" "Cleared, for now. His record is clean. He followed command protocol, but he also logged his concerns during the flight." "Good," Margaret said. "That matters." Mark hesitated, then continued. "There's more." She waited. "2 prior complaints," he said. "Informal. One from a junior attendant, one from a contractor. Both dismissed at the time, labeled as personality conflicts." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Not in surprise, in confirmation. "That's how patterns survive," she said, "by being reduced to inconvenience." Mark nodded. Legal will recommend a settlement route if this escalates. It will escalate, Margaret replied, and we won't settle quietly. Mark looked up. That's going to attract attention. Yes, Margaret said evenly. It should. Outside the glass, a small regional jet taxied past, ordinary and anonymous. Margaret watched it for a moment, thinking of the thousands of people who would never know her name, never need to. The system was not built for recognition. It was built for outcomes. A soft knock came at the door. Emily stood there, hair pulled back, uniform replaced by a simple sweater and slacks. She looked smaller out of uniform, younger, human. "Miss Lewis?" she asked. "Come in," Margaret said. Emily stepped inside, clutching a folded document in both hands. Her eyes darted briefly to Mark, then back to Margaret. "I gave my statement," Emily said, "like you told me." Margaret studied her face, the tension in her jaw, the exhaustion beneath it. "And?" Margaret asked. Emily swallowed. "I told them everything, even the parts that made me look weak." Margaret's gaze softened. Telling the truth rarely makes us look strong in the moment. Emily nodded. They said I did the right thing." "They're right," Margaret said. Emily hesitated. "I don't know what happens next." Margaret leaned back slightly. "Neither do I. But I know this. You won't be punished for integrity here." Emily's eyes filled. She blinked hard. "Thank you." Margaret inclined her head. "Go home. Be with your family. We'll talk after the holiday." Emily let out a breath she'd been holding for days. "Merry Christmas," she said softly. Margaret watched her leave, the door closing gently behind her. Mark cleared his throat. Public relations will want guidance. Margaret turned back to him. "They can wait." "They won't like that." "They don't have to." Mark smiled faintly. "You're going to make some people uncomfortable." "I already have," Margaret said. "That's not the same thing as doing harm." She stood, gathering her coat. The room felt smaller now, its purpose fulfilled. "Schedule a full review," she continued. "Not just flight crew, training, dispatch, reporting structures. I want to know where silence is being rewarded." Mark nodded, already typing. "Understood." Margaret paused at the door, looking once more at the runway beyond the glass. Frost glinted on the pavement, fragile and temporary. "Mark," she said. "Yes?" "Next time someone is told they don't belong," she said quietly. "I want the system to correct it before I ever have to." Mark met her gaze. "We'll work toward that." Margaret stepped out into the hallway. The terminal was waking up around her, ordinary and indifferent. She moved through it without escort, without ceremony. Outside, the mountains stood unchanged. Inside, something fundamental had shifted. Not loudly, not cleanly, but enough. The town below the mountains moved slowly that morning, as if aware it had been given a warning it did not fully understand. Snowbanks lined the streets in uneven walls, scarred by tires and footprints, the evidence of people passing through without ever really stopping. Christmas decorations hung from lampposts, blinking red and green against a sky the color of steel. Everything looked peaceful. Nothing felt resolved. Margaret watched it all from the back seat of the sedan as it wound its way through town. The driver said nothing. He didn't need to. He had been hired for discretion, not conversation. The car smelled faintly of leather and pine, clean and restrained, like a place where nothing unnecessary was allowed to linger. Her phone rested in her lap, dark and silent for the first time since the night before. She let it stay that way. At a red light, she caught her reflection in the window. Tired eyes, steady mouth. A woman who had learned to carry consequences without letting them hollow her out. She thought of her mother, long gone now, who had taught her that dignity was not a posture, but a practice. Something you did every day, whether anyone was watching or not. The car pulled up in front of a low stone building near the edge of town. No sign, no marquee, just glass doors and a discreet plaque with a law firm's name etched into it. Margaret stepped out, the cold biting instantly at her cheeks, and walked inside without hesitation. The conference room was already occupied. 3 people sat around the table. 2 men, 1 woman, all in their 50s or early 60s, all with faces shaped by years of quiet authority rather than public recognition. They stood when Margaret entered. "Thank you for coming," the woman said. Her name was Claire Donnelly, former federal investigator, now counsel. "I know you didn't plan on spending Christmas Eve like this." Margaret took a seat. "No one ever does." They exchanged glances, the unspoken acknowledgement of that truth passing easily between them. Claire slid a folder across the table. "We've reviewed the initial reports, flight crew statements, passenger accounts, video from the terminal. It's consistent." Margaret opened the folder, but did not read it yet. "Consistent how?" "With a culture that relies too heavily on assumption," one of the men said, "and protects it." Margaret nodded. "I expected that." Claire leaned forward slightly. "There's something else." Margaret looked up. "The pilots' union has already been notified," Claire continued. "They're preparing a response. Nothing aggressive yet, but they'll frame this as a misunderstanding unless there's pressure." Margaret closed the folder. "There will be pressure." "From where?" the second man asked. Margaret met his gaze. "From truth." Silence settled over the room. Not uncomfortable, just deliberate. Claire broke it. "You know what this means? If you push for transparency, this won't stay contained. The media will find it, advocacy groups, regulators." "Yes," Margaret said. "They should." "You'll be scrutinized too," Claire said gently. "Every contract, every decision you've made. People will look for hypocrisy." Margaret's mouth curved slightly. "They always do." The man to Claire's left shifted. "Are you prepared for that?" Margaret did not hesitate. "I've been prepared my entire life." They studied her for a moment, then nodded. The decision was already made. This meeting was not about permission. It was about alignment. Outside, a snowplow rumbled past, scraping against pavement, loud and indifferent. Later that afternoon, Margaret returned to her hotel. The lobby was warm, filled with the scent of evergreen and coffee. A piano played softly in the corner, someone practicing carols without flourish. Families moved through the space in heavy coats, children dragging mittens, faces flushed from cold and anticipation. Margaret paused near the window, watching them. This was what people meant when they talked about peace. Order, predictability, the luxury of not having to examine yourself too closely. Her phone buzzed once. She checked it. A message from Mark. Initial staff meeting completed. Reactions mixed. Some defensive, some relieved. Training review underway. More to follow. Margaret typed a brief response. "Keep going." She slipped the phone back into her coat and took the elevator upstairs. Her room overlooked the valley. Snow fell steadily now, soft and relentless, erasing tracks almost as quickly as they were made. She sat by the window, coat still on, and let herself be still for the first time since the night began. The weight settled in then. Not regret, responsibility. She thought of Captain Holloway, sitting somewhere under fluorescent lights, replaying the moment where everything tipped. She thought of Robert Whittaker, driving away with his silence finally loud enough to hear. She thought of Linda, whose certainty had cracked, but not yet broken. Change rarely came cleanly. It came in fractures. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Emily. "Thank you for today. I talked to my mother. She said I did the right thing, even if it scared me." Margaret stared at the message longer than necessary. She typed back, "Fear doesn't mean you're wrong. It means something matters." Emily responded almost immediately. "Merry Christmas, Ms. Lewis." Margaret set the phone aside and closed her eyes. Outside, the town prepared for morning rituals. Church bells would ring. Gifts would be opened. Apologies would be offered or withheld. Life would continue, unbothered by the quiet shifts happening beneath its surface. Margaret remained at the window as night fell again, lights blinking on one by one across the valley. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vindicated. She felt clear, the kind of clarity that came not from winning, but from refusing to look away. Somewhere far below, a plane lifted off into the dark, carrying strangers who would never know her name. And that was fine. What mattered was that the next person who sat quietly in a seat they were told they did not deserve might not have to endure the same silence. That was how change worked. Not with noise, with persistence. The story did not end when the snow melted. By early January, the investigation had moved from internal memos to formal interviews. Offices that once felt untouchable now smelled faintly of stale coffee and unease. Doors closed more often. Conversations dropped in volume when someone unfamiliar passed by. The system, long comfortable with its own reflection, had begun to notice cracks. Margaret returned to Chicago quietly. No press, no statement. Her office overlooked the river, gray and swollen with winter runoff. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything was under review. She sat at the long table in the executive conference room as department heads filtered in one by one. Men and women in tailored suits, average age hovering in the late 50s, early 60s. Veterans, survivors. People who had built careers by understanding which rules bent and which ones broke you. They did not sit casually. Margaret waited until the last chair was filled. "This is not a meeting about one flight," she said. Her voice was calm, even, but it carried weight. The kind earned over decades, not borrowed from position. "This is about patterns," she continued. "About what we excuse when it makes our lives easier. About what we label as misunderstanding because naming it honestly would require change." A man at the far end of the table shifted. "With respect," he said, "we've handled incidents like this before." Margaret met his eyes. "Exactly." Silence followed. She slid a thin stack of papers across the table. Summaries, not accusations. Timelines. Decisions made and not made. Complaints softened until they disappeared. "This is the cost of silence," Margaret said. "Not lawsuits, not headlines. Trust." Another executive spoke, a woman with silver hair pulled back tight. "What are you asking for?" Margaret did not hesitate. Mandatory authority review, independent reporting channels, real consequences for misuse of command, and training that does not treat bias as a personality flaw, but as an operational risk. The word risk landed hard. These were people who understood risk. One by one they nodded. Not all of them, but enough. Across town, Captain Holloway sat in a rented apartment, the walls bare, the television muted. He watched the news scroll silently across the bottom of the screen. His name never mentioned, his absence unnoticed. The quiet was worse than punishment. It left room for memory. He replayed the moment in the aisle, the way he had spoken, the certainty he had felt. He had told himself it was about order, about efficiency. He understood now how easily authority lied when it wanted comfort. He closed his eyes and let the realization sit. heavy and unavoidable. In another part of the city, Robert Whittaker stood in his kitchen, staring at a half-packed suitcase. He had been invited to a retreat he no longer felt welcome at. He picked up his phone, typed a message, erased it, then finally sent one he could not undo. To a junior colleague. An apology. An acknowledgement. A promise to do better when it counted. It was small, but it was something. Linda avoided mirrors. When she did catch her reflection, she looked away too quickly. Invitations arrived less frequently now. Whispers followed her into rooms she once dominated. She told herself it was temporary, that people forgot. Sometimes they did. But something in her had shifted. A hairline fracture she could feel, but not yet name. Emily started training again in February. Different aircraft, different crew. The work felt the same. The weight did not. She spoke up more now. Not loudly, just enough. When a senior attendant dismissed a nervous passenger, Emily intervened gently, firmly. Her hands shook afterward. She did it anyway. Margaret watched these changes from a distance. She did not interfere. She did not manage optics. She let outcomes speak. One evening, she stood alone on the riverwalk, cold wind cutting through her coat. The city lights reflected off dark water, broken and shimmering. She thought of how easily power forgot itself, how often it mistook habit for truth. Her phone buzzed. A single message from Mark. Regulators satisfied. Policy changes approved. Pushback ongoing, but progress real. Margaret typed back. Good. She slipped the phone away and looked out over the water. She had not sought to teach anyone a lesson. She had sought to correct a trajectory, to nudge a system back towards something resembling integrity. It would not be enough. It never was. But it was a start. And sometimes, that was how history moved. Not in speeches, not in applause. In quiet moments where someone chose not to look away. Margaret turned and walked back toward the city, her steps steady, her breath visible in the cold air. The world would keep testing itself. So would she. The letter arrived on heavy paper, the kind that resisted the fingers slightly when opened, as if reminding the reader that words still had weight. Margaret read it standing by the window, city traffic murmuring far below, winter light slanting across the floor. It was an official notice from the aviation board, carefully worded, formally restrained. Findings confirmed, violations noted, corrective measures mandated, names omitted, consequences implied. It was exactly what she had expected, and still it tightened something in her chest. She folded the letter once, then again, and set it on the table beside a stack of similar documents. Endings rarely felt like endings. They felt like doors quietly closing behind you, while others opened without ceremony. Later that afternoon, she met Mark for coffee in a small place near the river. No reservation, no privacy screen. Just two people sitting at a narrow table while steam rose from chipped mugs. Mark looked older than he had a month ago. So did she. They're adjusting faster than I thought, he said. Not because they want to, because they have to. Margaret nodded. Pressure works when it's applied consistently. There will still be resentment. There always is, she replied. Change doesn't feel fair to the people who benefited from the old rules. Mark hesitated. Do you ever wish you'd said something earlier? On the plane? Margaret considered the question without answering it directly. If I had, she said slowly, they would have apologized, smiled, promised improvement, and gone back to behaving the same way once they felt safe again. Mark smiled faintly. So you let the truth show itself? I gave it room, Margaret said. That's different. When she returned to her office, the building was already emptying out for the holiday weekend. Lights dimmed automatically as she walked the halls. The quiet felt earned. She stopped by the conference room, the same one where the first internal meeting had been held weeks earlier. The chairs were pushed in now, the table polished. No trace of tension left behind. That was how institutions worked. They absorbed impact and erased evidence. Margaret did not sit. She stood at the head of the table for a moment, then turned and left, closing the door gently behind her. That evening, she drove herself home. No driver, no calls. The radio played softly, an old soul song she hadn't heard in years. At a red light, she watched a man help an older woman across the street, their steps slow and careful. No cameras, no applause, just decency practiced without witnesses. At home, she took off her coat and set it over the back of a chair. The house was warm, quiet, lived in. Books lined the walls. Photographs sat in frames that did not match. Evidence of a life built over time, not curated for anyone else's approval. She poured a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table. Her phone lay nearby. She picked it up and scrolled, not through news, not through updates, but through messages she had not yet answered. One from Emily, sent that morning. "Started my new rotation today." Different captain, different tone. It felt better. Margaret smiled. Another message, this one from an unfamiliar number. "Thank you for what you did. I didn't know how to speak up until I saw someone else do it first." Margaret stared at that one longer. She did not reply. Some gratitude was meant to be held, not exchanged. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and unannounced. It gathered on the steps, on the bare branches of the trees, on the roof of the car she had parked without thinking. It covered without erasing. It reminded her that time did not wait for resolution. She thought of Captain Holloway, wherever he was now. Of Robert, learning the cost of silence. Of Linda, confronting the unfamiliar weight of consequence. Of Emily, standing a little straighter than before. None of them were villains. None of them were heroes. They were people, moving through a system that rewarded comfort and punished disruption, until someone refused to play along. Margaret finished her water and stood, rinsing the glass before placing it upside down on the rack. A small habit, a grounding one. Before bed, she checked her phone one last time. A notification from the company's internal platform confirmed that the new reporting channels were live. Anonymous, independent, protected. It was not perfect. It would be tested. But it existed now, and that mattered. She turned off the light and stood for a moment in the dark, listening to the house settle. Somewhere, far away, another plane crossed the sky. Somewhere closer, someone would be told that they didn't belong. Or maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't be. Margaret lay down and closed her eyes, the quiet steady around her. She did not feel victorious. She felt resolved. Stories like this were never about winning. They were about recognition, about choosing, again and again, not to look away when it would be easier to do so. About understanding that power revealed character, not when it was challenged by equals, but when it was exercised over those who seemed to have none. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can reach people who value integrity. And, if it sparked something in you, leave a comment with these 3 words. Speak up, always.